Hey guys, how's it going? By the time this video goes up, hopefully on the 27th of July 2023, it will be the 70th anniversary since the ceasefire ending the Korean War was signed and went into effect. And I just wanted to make a bit of a video today talking about that ceasefire, but more importantly, the 2 days leading up to it and its effect on the Australian troops fighting in Korea. I've chosen to come do this little bit of a talk at the Sydney Korean War Memorial behind me, located in Moore Park. It's a fantastic little memorial. If you're in Sydney, I strongly encourage you guys to come out and have a look at it. But without further ado, I'm going to get into talking about the last few days of the war for our country. So essentially, several days before the 27th, both sides, the North and the South, so essentially the Communists and the United Nations, came to an agreement on the terms that should be accepted for the Korean conflict to come to an end. For about 2 years, the demands of each power had gone back and forth, largely disputing over what would happen to POWs once the war ended. Essentially, the Americans, leading the United Nations side of the talk, demanded that POW repatriation should be on a voluntary basis only, whereas the communists wanted all their POWs back. Neither side could compromise on this. However, in the end, the communists did compromise and a voluntary repatriation agreement was signed. So leading up to the 27th, everyone knew the war was coming to an end. The fact that the talks had been agreed upon had gotten out. The soldiers knew that the end was coming. However, many were looking for that last one big huzzah, and most notably was the Chinese army. In the final stages of the war, the Chinese decided to launch one last big all-out offensive in certain sections of the line in an attempt to capture United Nations held positions and for some reason boost their strategic holdings on the land. So all this culminated in the few days leading up to the ceasefire. On the 23rd and throughout the 24th, Chinese artillery heavily pounded a section of the United Nations defences known as the Hook, which went along the Samichon River and the Incheon River. Essentially, they were trying to soften up the United Nations lines in preparation for this last attack. The United Nations were aware of this, however, and on the 23rd and again the 24th started moving their positions into a strategic outpost along the front line. This included the 2nd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment on the Hook itself, with the several American units off to their flank. On the evening of the 23rd and into the early morning hours of the 24th, on the evening of the 24th going into the early morning hours of the 25th, the Chinese launched their attack. Their artillery bombardment intensified, and everyone knew that the attack was coming, and so the forward outposts were manned, the soldiers were put on a stand to, and they just waited. And sure enough, as soon as the sun started to set, the Chinese started moving in. First they used advanced mortar positions to again try and soften up those outposts, and then finally they launched an all-out assault with the infantry. It is in these initial bombardments of the mortars that the first two Australian deaths of the Battle of Samichon River occurred, those being Private Patrick Green and Private Albert Wells. You'll forgive me, I've had to write them down so I don't forget. Both these men were killed by shrapnel from mortar and artillery blast before midnight on the evening of the 24th of July, and they were soon to be some of the last casualties of the Australian forces in the Korean War. As the night went on, the Americans suffered under intense attacks from communist forces, though they did manage to hold their position, suffering quite heavy casualties themselves. 2 RAR and to a lesser extent some elements of 3 RAR were also attacked by infantry. However, casualties were relatively light, and apart from Green and Wells, no further Australians were killed in the engagement. On the 25th, the sun rose and the Chinese halted their attacks as they always did, since now that the United Nations would be under the protection of their air force and artillery, which would simply decimate the Chinese, as they well knew from experience. And so the Chinese withdrew and they went into hiding. The Australians refortified their positions, and they were still under attack from Chinese artillery throughout the day of the 25th and going into the evening. On the evening of the 25th, the second day of the Battle of Samichon River commenced, with Chinese intensifying their bombardment around 11 p.m. At this point, it is worth mentioning that 2 RAR, Royal Australian Regiment, are going to play a much more significant role in the second night of the fighting. They consisted of a few lines of defence. You had the main line of defence, which were Australian dud trenches along the ridge of the Hook, which were occupied by the majority of the Australian troops. Forward of this, you had a number of outposts, one of them being a key permanently dud outpost known as Greenfinger, the rest being hastily assembled static outposts that were put out each night. Initially, there was no casualties suffered from the bombardment on the evening of the 25th. However, shortly after midnight, Private Ronald McCoy was struck by shrapnel and killed almost instantly. And almost very shortly after that, Private John Russell was also struck by shrapnel, and again he died on the battlefield. Around 12:30 to 1:30, the Chinese began their assaults, and they began it in force. The brunt of these assaults being absorbed by the Australian forward outpost at Greenfinger and a few other scattered positions. One of these hastily assembled forward outposts was commanded by Corporal Kevin Cooper, who was actually on his second tour of Korea. His first one had been with 1 RAR the year prior. However, he had opted to stay on and provide his useful experience to the new 2 RAR who were replacing them. Cooper led his men with gallantry and managed to maintain an open line of communications from the shell crater that he was using as a forward outpost all the way back to the main trench line. However, around 2:30 a.m, the Chinese assaults began to put too much strain on the Australian position, and they were ordered by Battalion HQ to withdraw back to the main line of resistance, the trenches on top of the Hook. Cooper assembled his men and started leading them out of the trench and up the hill towards the Australian positions. About halfway up the slope, however, an artillery shell exploded just off to Cooper's side, and a piece of shrapnel entered the side of his head, killing him instantly. Cooper would become the second last Australian soldier to die in the Korean War. The last goes to Leon Dawes. Private Leon Dawes was in the Greenfinger, the permanent outpost, with his squad mates, and they were under intense artillery bombardment and quite intense infantry assault as well. Around 2:45 a.m. to 3 a.m. in the morning, on the 26th of July 1953, a Chinese artillery shell exploded just outside the Greenfinger, and a piece of shrapnel entered Private Dawes' rear abdomen and went through into his chest. Dawes fell to the ground when one of his comrades held him in his arms, and he looked up to him and said, "There is terrible pain in my back." For 3 minutes, Dawes was cradled in his comrade's arms before he finally succumbed to his wounds and died there on the battlefield. Private Dawes was the last Australian soldier to be killed in action in the Korean War. Others would die as a result of their wounds later on, or of illness or accident. However, Dawes was the last one to be killed on the battlefield in the time of war. Greenfinger was shortly evacuated thereafter, his comrades carrying his body up the hill to the Australian trenches. The following day, all 6 bodies from those killed in the 2 RAR were taken back to a field station and then shipped back down to Busan, where they were buried in the United Nations War Cemetery. The following day, on the 27th of July 1953, delegates from the north and the south met in Panmunjom, South Korea, to sign the ceasefire agreement. They were led by a North Korean and American general. They went in around 10 a.m. in the morning on the 27th. Each sat down without saying a word to each other, signed off approximately 9 or 10 copies of the ceasefire agreement, and again, without saying a word to each other, stood up and each went their own ways. That night at 10 p.m, the guns would fall silent on the Korean peninsula, and the war, for all intents and purposes, was effectively over. However, no ceasefire followed no peace treaty followed the ceasefire, and to this day the war is technically still ongoing. However, there's been very little, if not no, further instances of armed conflict between the North and the South, apart from the occasional skirmish along the border. So all in all, this is, on today, on the 27th of July, pause to remember all those who died in the Korean War, but specifically those last Sits who died needlessly after the terms of a ceasefire had been agreed upon, and a mere hours before it went into effect. And to those who didn't make it home, lest we forget.